We would like to acknowledge that the episodes in this series are produced on the traditional unceded lands of the Coast Salish peoples, which includes the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. We thank them for allowing us to be their guests.
Well, okay, I was born in Montreal to a mixed marriage. My father's not Jewish and my mother is Jewish, and I don't know if that's how you define a mixed marriage, by who somebody is not. But anyway, the Jewish family is in Montreal, and that was my closest family. My father's from the prairies, and he left that world, and consequently we didn't grow up with his family. We grew up with my mother's family, and they were a middle class, educated, part of the left wing intelligentsia.
What did they do?
My mother was a social worker and my father was an engineer. And they were in the 30s and 40s, I'm not sure when, up until the 50s, they were communists. Mm-hmm. And so were all of their friends, all of the people that I grew up with. And one of the interesting things about what I think of my childhood was my grandfather, who was a businessman and had a big firm printing on fabric. And it became quite huge. He made lots of money, and one of my uncles was the art director in that firm. He decided with a group of his business cronies to buy some land outside of Montreal, maybe 45 minutes north. It's sort of a little bit the same, the Duddy Kravitz story, and build an intentional community, not where everybody was going to live, but where everybody would summer. Right? So they dammed up a stream, made a little lake. He built a house big enough for his 3 daughters and their families. So it had 7 bedrooms. And every summer, and all the houses, there was about 10 families that built houses around that little lake that had rowboats, no canoes, no kayaks or anything like that. Now it does, but in those days, this would have been in the 40s that it was built. All the families were friends in Montreal. They were all of the same political stripe. They were all active in whatever, politics were going on. They were all interested in the same literature, the same music. And we went up, I don't think anybody's place at that time when I was a little kid, nobody's place was winterized. But the summer was, all the women were there and the children. And they hired the nursery school teacher from Montreal, who was my nursery school teacher when I was 3, red diaper babies, so that's what we were.
Yeah, right.
So the mothers were there with the kids all summer long. We had a day camp to go to. Everybody was taken care of. As far as I could tell, the mothers spent their time either hanging out with each other in each other's homes or laying on the beach sunning themselves.
This is a great advertisement for communism.
Yeah.
It really, hey. Yeah.
Well, it was an interesting beginning for, how I started off in the theater and where I ended up and why I gravitated towards something like that. But what I found fascinating as I grew, I was there every summer till I was 12. But then my parents had somewhere in there moved to Toronto. So I grew up in Toronto, not Montreal. But it was blissful.
Yeah.
And the families were close. There was a path that went behind every house all the way around. Like the houses faced the lake on big lots, and behind was the forest. But there was a path that connected all the houses. So you became the children of all the other parents. But anyway, so that was my childhood. And somewhere in there, my parents, who were now living in Toronto, decided to build a cottage closer to Toronto so that my dad could be involved in going up on weekends and spending the summers there. So on a little lake with some other old party people,
Right.
they with whom I'm still good friends, and whom, I mean, everybody, I don't know if you know this, but everybody who was in that era of communism, everybody who was sentient in 1956 when Khrushchev denounced Stalin,
Yeah.
everybody left the party. And I can't imagine how devastated some people felt, because
Yeah.
some people were so invested
Yeah,
in,
that was a big schism.
yeah.
That was, yeah.
But all of my parents' friends, with the exception of one or two, left the party then.
Uh-huh.
So I don't know what they did, and that discussion never came up. Like, I never asked my parents how they felt when they left the party. We just
Yeah.
knew that happened.
Yeah.
Life went on. We still went to the cottage. We still couldn't have a meal without having some kind of discussion about capitalism or what was going on in the world. That was the world I grew up in. And when I was little, when I was 5, my parents, I guess, discovered I was interested in art and drawing things and making things. So they put me in an art class. It was a special art class run by one of, and I noticed this, John Lazarus mentioned this. It was run by one of the acolytes of Arthur Lismer. Arthur Lismer was responsible for art education in Canada. Before he was active doing that, there was no serious art education. He brought so much into the world, and he trained a whole group of women who were there. I can't remember the one who was in Montreal, but they were fantastic teachers. So this woman who was my teacher, her name was Irma Sutcliffe, and I think they were all, the group of 7 hung out with the WASP intelligentsia in Montreal, in Toronto. So it was an interesting thing. I came from a, middle-ish class. I don't know where we fit. I never thought we were poor, but I knew we weren't rich. It was that kind of world. But the art classes were in Irma's house. And her house was an old Victorian house in downtown Toronto that had beveled glass windows above the bay windows,
Right.
with colored glass in them. And when we came into her house, I started classes when I started there when I was 5. I have to say I didn't ever stop. I was there every year for my whole life. It was the one thing that I never not wanted to do. And I not wanted to do many, many other things that, like go to school. But when you walked into that room, there was a door, leaded glass. You walked in, there was a foyer with beautiful marble tiles and colored tiles, and then there was another door with more leaded glass. And when I first went there, there was a dog, a Dalmatian, of course, named Spot. So Spot greeted everybody, all the kids to the classes. And I thought it was kind of weird that the classes were in the living room. Front room, a big front room, also had a fireplace and a piano. But there was no furniture in there, maybe some tables and brown paper spread out on the floor. And this was one of Lismer's things, that he started art classes at the Art Gallery in Toronto, also at the Art Gallery in Montreal. And I know that Doris Shadbolt was connected somehow to him, because when I was coming out here, Irma told me to look up Doris Shadbolt because she was part of this whole system. And trained by Lismer in a method of teaching art to children. I was fascinated by the fact that you'd walk into this room where the art supplies were all laid out, and you had to wait for all the other children to arrive. while you were waiting, there was little tables where there would be little pieces of paper, and every class it was different. There might be little pieces of white paper with a couple of different colored crayons. Then the next time there would be pieces of paper that were different shapes with maybe only a black piece of charcoal or something, so that there was something for you to do while you were waiting, and it was always different. So to me, that was a magical thing, you know?
Sure, yeah.
And the fact that it was little, because we were little, you know? There was, you know, prisms that made stuff, you know, colors dance, colored light dance in this room. And it was so different than the environment that I lived in. And it just was so inspiring to me as a kid.
Wonderful.
But if you had to go to the bathroom, you had to walk by another room, which turned out was the dining room, and it was so full of furniture you couldn't move around. And I thought, how weird is this family that, like, where do they actually eat? There's upside down chairs on the table. There was all the furniture from the living room, and it was years before I realized that. And then we did painting, drawing, clay. You didn't call it sculpture. It was just working with clay, working with some other materials. One of them was asbestos powder mixed with paste.
Okay. Those are the old
As
days.
children, yeah, it was the old days. And I don't know how much these classes cost. It never occurred to me that somebody had to pay for them. But they had, Irma and her sister also ran a class in the same house. But the way that the classes worked was you'd arrive, we'd all sit around in a circle, and that's when Irma would tell us what we were doing. She would tell us the theme for the class. And it might be circus, it might be transportation, it might be groups of people. And we'd sit around in a circle, and she had these files full of pictures. That is, you know, the forerunner to the internet or something like that. She would cut them out of magazines. So she'd pass pictures around, and you'd talk about what we were doing. And then she'd say, okay, we're doing a painting, or we're going to do a clay sculpture, or we're going to do construction. That would be like a set, you know, a model for a set, but it wasn't called that. And we made puppets, we made masks, we made costumes, we made figures, we made...
Wow.
I realized that it was such a great training for working in the theater, because
Sure, yeah.
I knew by the time I was done that, I knew how to make everything. I had experience with when we made a mask. You didn't just make a mask and put it on the wall. Then you'd have to, when it was finished, she'd say, okay, now we'd have to improvise a little situation with the masks. And the same with when we made puppets. You had to have put on a little puppet play, just for a few minutes, like nothing grand, but so that you got a sense that what you were making didn't end just with an object. It ended with something that maybe got used again, that maybe was portrayed some kind of other thing, and also that brought other interests into it, you know, like maybe even music or something like that. So
That sounds like a pretty good way to grow up for someone who's...
yeah, my parents encouraged every step of the way. And when I became a teenager, I became a monitor for these art classes, and then I became a protege of Irma's, and I worked teaching art to children, and I thought that was going to be my
job.
my career.
Yeah.
I was not too interested in school, so by the time I was in grade 12, in some suburban high school that I never wanted to go to, but I did end up my last year in that school having art classes 4 days a week. And I was in that, but at that point, there was a gifted class that was in the art gallery that I was part of, and so I kind of knew that I was headed, in my mind, to a course at U of T that was called Art and Archaeology. And if you've read Margaret Atwood, in her early writings, a lot of her characters were in that course, because it was a pretty famous course at U of T.
Okay.
And you, in your third year, maybe even your second year, you got to go to a dig somewhere, you know, Egypt, or I'm not sure
Sounds
where else.
wonderful.
But it was something. In grade 12, they decided to cancel that course.
Oh,
And in Ontario, then you had to go to grade 13. So I went to grade 13 with half-heartedly, and I thought, you know what? I'm not going to go to U of T if they don't have that course. I'll go to OCA, which was the art school. You only needed grade 12 for that. So I dropped out in the middle of grade 13, to my parents' horror, that I now was not going to go to university. I was just going to go to art school. You know, in the long run, they supported that, but you know, the art school was taught and run by artists,
right.
not teacher. You know, not
Academics.
not academics.
Yeah.
And I don't know what U of T would have been like. I didn't go. But I loved OCA. It was a fantastic school, and I studied drawing and painting. But it was the 60s.
Yeah, right.
There was too much going on. There was too many demonstrations at the American Embassy.
Now, what year was this when you went there?
66.
66, okay.
The civil rights movement was happening. There was demonstrations, you know, all my teenage life, and there was a place that grew up in Toronto, the Yorkville Village, that was filled with coffee houses. And
Right.
as teenagers, we could go to them because they didn't serve alcohol. And they stayed open late at night, and they had folk singers and interesting, strange people. So I gravitated to downtown Toronto. And then somewhere in there, I decided, I think in my third year, I decided to go to the States. I got a scholarship to go to an art school in Philadelphia, and from there, I ended up living in New York. And it was a school that was much like Ontario College of Art. I don't know why I changed, and it's been a mystery to me ever since.
Right.
It was a classical art school with the classical painters of that period. I forget what it was called. Something like the Hudson River School, and like Sloan and Paul Pio and stuff. The school was called the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art. And at one point it was just a girls' art school, but not when I went there. Anyway, it was interesting living in Philadelphia then, but it was still the 60s, and I met somebody who ended up being Riel's father. I met him in New York, started hanging out in New York. New York was a pretty wild place to be in 1967, 68. Moved in with him in New York, and one day we were sitting there in the East River late at night, because he taught at Brooklyn College. He taught at night, so we had a nightlife.
Uh-huh.
We were watching the sun come up in the East River, didn't notice that the tide had come up, and we were stranded out on some rocks. And we said, why don't we move to the country? And we went up to, that weekend we drove up to Woodstock, and there was a festival happening there, a music festival, and I don't know, we saw people that were dressed in leather jerkins and flowers in their hair, and we said, why don't we move here? This looks like some kind of heaven. And we knew that there was all these musicians. Woodstock was an artist colony from the
Right.
20s, and that was an interesting twist in my life, because I didn't really know, okay, what am I going to do? What happened to my career of any sort? And yeah, we decided to move back to Canada. We missed CBC. There was a bunch of things that we missed.
Just a little plug there. We'll just cut that out, put that on the TV.
And it happened that we came back to Canada And we followed the politics in Canada with you know, a lot of eagerness. And we happened to come back because we drove up to Montreal to head out here. And we arrived there the day that the Mounties, or whoever it was, that the police were escorting the FLQ.
War Measures Act. Yeah,
And
right.
it was the FLQ crisis.
Yeah.
And there was this motorcade, you know, dozens of motorcycles, police cars and stuff heading out to the airport. And we watched that. Anyway, we had heard that there was some interesting activity happening out here at Simon Fraser. And so at this point, I was kind of more interested in politics than in art. I didn't seem to be becoming a painter. I mostly had studied or had excelled at printmaking, and you know, to be a printmaker on your own was going to be a bit challenging because you needed to have a space, you needed to have a press, you needed to have a bunch of stuff, or become part of an institution. And Ralph got an LIP grant when we came to Vancouver. He confessed many years later he had never touched a video camera, but it didn't matter. He wrote a good. But we hired some people who had been making videos, and because I think what I was doing in Vancouver in those days, well, I was having a baby, that was one thing. I was making posters for various organizations that, you know, sort of counterculture organizations, and I was kind of floundering a bit. I was still kind of not really thinking, well, what am I going to do to make money?
Right.
Partly, you know, I was being supported by this man that I was living with, who then one day said, we bought a little house out in Deep Cove, past Deep Cove actually, in Woodlands. But one day I came home and he said he didn't want to, he'd been teaching at Douglas College, he said he didn't want to teach anymore, he'd like to just write. So I could see then, there goes my meal ticket, right? And we have a baby. So I got here in whatever it was, 71, and I was kind of just extending my art school career. I was doing posters, and I was not quite sure whether I wanted to be a textile artist or a metal artist or even a potter or something. For some reason or other, I didn't want to be a painter, but and I met some friends who happened to have been in the National Theatre School in Montreal when Nick was there. He did a brief stint there in the late 60s or early 70s, maybe late 60s, where he was running the English section. I got introduced to Nick, who was a pretty compelling person.
Very interesting guy.
Yeah.
Very interesting guy for sure.
You know, kind of clicked all my boxes. You know, he was charming, he was fascinating, he was erudite, and he was political, and that was really, you know, clicked with me. And so he asked me, after a few discussions with Sandy, who was the actress that came out with him.
Sandy Nichols. Sandy Nichols,
yeah. Do you want to design Net City? And as it turned out, I believe this is true. He had decided to. Nobody told me this at the time. He had decided to pick a designer and a musical composer that didn't have, you know, particular training in theater.
Right.
He wanted them to be of the field and get that kind of, I don't know, maybe a raw thing. I'm not sure, because Doug was playing in a band, and
Doug Dodd,
yeah, and So I said yes, because I just wanted to be around this guy and around this thing. I had never had any even inkling of going into the theater. I wasn't in drama club in high school. I didn't really know what it was all about. It turned out, because of my art school and previous art training, I did have a lot of skill in making things and designing things and stuff, but just never for this particular function. So when I set about designing this, at one point I went to Nick and I said, listen, you got to find me a real designer that I can at least bounce my ideas. I don't want to be reinventing the wheel. I don't want to be doing something stupid.
Right.
And he didn't think that was going to be a big problem, but he found me this woman, Joyce, Joyce Osier,
Right.
who was doing her master's at UBC in theater design. And after, I don't know, a week or two, she said, you don't need me, you know what you're doing.
Right.
So that was sort of affirming, and we kind of bonded around that. I mean, she kind of became my mentor.
Yeah.
And in that time period, I lived in a communal house over on right next to the Culch, which is sort of serendipitous. And Nick lived there, and Frank Massey lived there. He was the lighting designer at the Playhouse at the time. Bob Cook lived there. He was a communications teacher at Simon Fraser.
Right.
Everybody ended up being in Net City, not Bob particularly. Net City was a wonderful experience for me.
It was a good show.
Yeah. And I don't know if I mentioned this before, but I had a 1-year-old baby at that time that I had left with her father. He had been teaching sociology, and he decided one day that he was going to not teach sociology anymore. He was just going to write. And so he said, I think you better get a job. Anyway, when I got this job designing the theater, I said, okay, I've got a job. He said, I didn't mean that kind of a job. So Net City had its own life. It was an exciting production.
Version of Brecht and Weil's Mahagoni.
Yeah.
And it was also done at the Pinder Ballroom.
The Pinder Ballroom, which was
It's a fabulous place.
Yeah,
with a gigantic mural.
Yeah, it was sort of a Soviet socialist style mural of a train.
Of all the different industry in British Columbia. Shipbuilding and mining and
I believe they just took that when they tore down that ballroom, they took that mural and put it in the Marine Center. The Union of Marine blah blah.
I really do hope that got saved, because that was incredible.
Yeah, it was a beautiful.
And when we say it was a big mural, it was 50 feet long and maybe 25 feet high at least, right? I mean,
it was big.
Covered the entire wall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was a terrific backdrop for this, because it was all about the working life of a country, of a community. So Joyce Osier and Frank Massey and Bob Cook, while all this was going on, they formed a company called the Royal Canadian Aerial Theatre. It was based on some work by a Dutch guy named Otto Pina. I just contacted Frank the other day and said, do you have any pictures of the RCAT? Because it was something that was really only visual.
Right.
Stuff happened in the sky, and that was the aerial component. So they started out with kites, and Frank was and still is a meticulous maker. He had a balance beam so that you could weigh each stick, so that everything was perfectly balanced. But the kites demanded there be wind, and there wasn't always wind. We did, a couple of events that would be all planned out and stuff like that where we'd just be sitting there waiting for the wind to come up.
Right.
And so that's when it was decided that, well, let's use helium balloons. Let's combine it with helium balloons. We did events all around Vancouver, in parks and beaches, and we had a big room, and this was the old art gallery that was on Georgia Street.
Right.
And so we decided to fill the helium balloons with both a combination of helium and air so that they would float at different heights off the floor, so that when you walked into this room, there would be balloons everywhere, but they weren't hanging from the ceiling or anything like that. They were kind of hovering in space.
Like a wheat field of balloons.
Yeah, but they were also like up high.
Right.
So that you were walking into this strange kind of, like a dreamscape of balloons. And I think it was probably all clear balloons on this. And then we had all these fans, like electric fans, and we had a big old stuffed chair with a fan like you would be fanning Sultan. And everything worked perfectly. It was a really beautiful thing until the audience came in, and there was, I don't know, about 50 or 70 people came in, and the body heat from all these people, the balloons just all rose to the ceiling.
Whoa, okay. Wow.
So, we didn't really have fans strong enough to blow them all down from the ceiling, so it was one of those you told God your plans moments.
Yeah, a little science.
But we got a gig at this little known World's Fair called the Spokane, the 1974 Spokane Environmental World's Fair.
Okay.
Nobody's ever heard of it, but there was a lot of people. We were there. We were a BC delegate along with Bill Reed, the Haida carver, and Elizabeth Roth, who was the famous performance artist. And the piece that we did there was called River Piece, and it was 3 big kites, big box kites. So they were, pretty giant size. And on the box kites were printed all the in large print so that you could read it when it was flying up in the air. All the companies that had plants along the river and that were putting pollutants into the river.
Right.
And so I might add that where the fair was situated was at the convergence of 2 rivers in Spokane. It was always very windy there, so we knew this was going to work. One of the signature things about the Royal Canadian Aerial Theatre was that there was an audience participation element that was very benign, so nobody had to do anything that was going to make them look stupid or anything like that. We would blow up the balloons, tie them off, and have them tie the balloons onto a big long string that was previously set up. So we had, I think 5 or 6 strings that would be 1,000 feet long or something like that, or 500 feet or 1,500. I can't remember, but really long, so that when they were filled with balloons, they were a big, long, snake-like thing. So we had, on the ground, we had all these strings set up, and blue balloons is what people were tying onto the string. So when we had 6 fingers like this of helium-filled balloons, we tied them all together in one string, and they were, we tied them onto the top of the BC Pavilion, which was some sort of a box type thing. And so they were just dancing in the wind, these big long strands that look kind of like a poetic version of a river. And we flew these box kites with that were attached to string that was coated with little wee chunks of broken glass, I think.
Right.
so that, and we flew them up into this dancing river, and pretty soon the strings started to shred the balloons.
Right.
And by the end of the event, these kites with the names of all the polluting companies had completely shredded the balloons, and it was just like a mass of limp, broken rubber that was just hanging off the building. So that was kind of what the whole attempt of this theater company was to do.
That actually sounds pretty cool. I like that.
It was cool. And in that era, we went to there in Ann Arbor, had the first invitational international experimental theater festival. So it was it was a big deal with all the companies that were avant-garde at the time. The Living Theater, Mabou Minds, the Iowa Theater Lab, Performance Group. Did I leave anyone out? Yeah, because there was a lot of companies, and it was a week-long event at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Yeah. We had to perform our event at night because we were using big, giant, clear balloons that we were going to hit once they were released. We were going to hit them with a spotlight, a searchlight. Right. But for some reason or other, part of the plan for our piece there, we needed giant black balloons. And you couldn't get giant black balloons. You couldn't buy them. You could buy giant red balloons that were weather balloons, and they were big, 4 or 5 feet across. So we were there trying to figure out how to paint these big, giant red balloons black. And there was no inside workshop, so we were in the auditorium where the big raked seats where everybody, and it also happened to be where everybody came in to check in.
Right.
So everybody could see these few people in the seats doing these, blowing up these giant balloons and trying to figure out what we were, who we were, because we were nobody famous and we were from Canada, Anyway, our piece ended up being quite a stunning piece, and because the week was rainy, every night that we were supposed to go on, we got canceled until.
I think this is a brilliant strategy.
We had this giant feminist symbol made of helium-filled clear balloons, and these big black balloons represented, I don't know, the patriarchy or something like that. Right. And there was a board full of nails that was tripped somehow by some kind of text that one of us read, and it rose up or flipped up, broke the black balloons, and anyway then somehow released this gigantic feminist symbol into the sky, and as soon as it went up and sort of straightened itself so that you could actually see that it was a feminist symbol, because it was about 20 feet across, we shone this searchlight on it and went up into the sky, and it looked like a necklace of pearls floating in the sky, and nobody really could tell. You could tell that it was a feminist symbol, and then it would kind of turn sideways, and you wouldn't.
This is the circle with the
cross. Yeah. But that was the piece that I thought, I want to do this. I want to keep doing theater. If there's anything like this, that is the rush that I got from doing that really cemented my urge more than designing a Brecht show.